Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now we begin story 1, the last granaries of Rome, feeding an empire on the brink. Rome, 5th century CE. The streets no longer bustle as they once did. The marble columns are still standing, some of them, anyway, but the empire is crumbling, visibly and audibly. What does not vanish in a blaze of glory is lost to the slow erosion of neglect. But amidst the politics, battles, and great historical upheavals lies a quieter story, one not often told. How the eternal city fed itself in the final days of imperial might. For centuries, the granaries of Rome were among the most important buildings in the known world. Massive warehouse complexes like the Horia Galbi held enough grain to feed over 1 million people. The entire economy of Roman North Africa, particularly regions like modern Tunisia, was oriented around feeding the city. Grain ships traveled across the Mediterranean on predictable routes, with timetables nearly as reliable as any modern logistics system. That is, until they weren't. By the early 400s, the logistical miracle that had been Rome's grain supply began to falter. The reasons were many: barbarian incursions, piracy, internal corruption, and perhaps most significantly, the secession of key provinces like Egypt and Africa. In 439, when the Vandals took Carthage, one of the breadbaskets of the empire, a century-old thread was severed. It's hard to overstate the impact this had on the people of Rome, especially those living day to day on state-subsidized food. Rome's famed annona, a grain dole system, had been one of the state's greatest welfare programs, designed not only for social equity but also as a tool of political stability. Every citizen registered in the city could claim a monthly ration of grain. When grain was abundant, the people were content. When it wasn't, riots followed. Feeding the machine. The story of food in late Rome isn't one of grandeur or gluttony. It's a story of logistics, bureaucracy, and slow decay. The grain came from afar: Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt before the rise of Alexandria's power under Augustus. It arrived in massive navis honorarii cargo ships capable of hauling hundreds of tons of grain. These ships required an entire class of sailors, builders, and porters to function. Upon arrival in the port of Ostia, the grain was offloaded, weighed, and processed under the supervision of Praefecti Annani, the Roman officials responsible for food distribution. Specialized mills ground it into flour, bakeries transformed it into bread, and warehouses stored it in case of emergency. But by the 5th century, cracks in this system were beginning to show. Pirates, once a minor nuisance, had become a genuine threat. The Western Roman navy had withered, and the empire could no longer protect its supply lines. Internal officials, now increasingly underpaid and corrupt, often siphoned grain for personal profit. Political instability led to missed shipments. Some years, the grain never came. Austerity and substitution. As the grain supply dried up, substitutes were found. Spelt, barley, and even chestnut flour became increasingly common. These were foods once considered peasant fare course, less nutritious and difficult to store. They were also more labor-intensive to process, requiring hand grinding or primitive water mills that hadn't yet reached widespread use in Italy. In response to scarcity, people innovated, not out of choice but necessity. Drying vegetables, fermenting fish into long-lasting sauces like garum, and smoking meats became essential techniques. Preservation was no longer a convenience. It was the difference between life and starvation. The elite began to hoard. The poor began to suffer. Food riots were not uncommon. In 408 CE, as Alaric and the Visigoths encircled the city, they imposed a siege that brought Rome to its knees. Eyewitness accounts describe horrifying scenes: parents selling children, and eventually, reports of cannibalism. These were not metaphorical or moralistic tales, but grim realities of starvation in a city that had once been the center of the world. The end of the dole. In 455 CE, after the sack of Rome by the Vandals, the annona system was finally dismantled. No more free grain, no more bread distribution. Rome had shrunk demographically, politically, and economically. What had once been a million-person metropolis now housed perhaps 100,000 scattered across ruins. The Horia, once humming with activity, fell into disuse. Rats, water damage, and neglect took their toll. Some were repurposed into housing or chapels, others collapsed entirely. The bones of the empire were being picked clean, and the last granaries stood as empty monuments to a better-fed past. Yet even as imperial structures faded, people adapted. Local agriculture saw a slow resurgence. Smallholder farms sprouted up where villas once stood. Gardens filled spaces between broken columns. People grew what they could: onions, leeks, legumes. Chickens and goats roamed freely through once formal forums. Life continued, if only barely. A quiet collapse. It is tempting to view the fall of Rome as a singular moment: 476 CE and the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. But for those living in the city, the collapse was not sudden. It was slow, hungry, and bureaucratic. It was the day the ship didn't come, the week the bakery closed, the month the prefectus vanished. In the dark corners of abandoned Horia, people likely took shelter, perhaps built fires where ledgers were once written. These spaces of commerce became spaces of survival. Civilization didn't end, it faded into a new form, one bread crust at a time. And so we are left with a lingering question. What happens to a society built on abundance when scarcity becomes the new normal? In the aftermath of Rome's glory, as the massive stones of the Forum crumbled and wild grasses sprouted between aqueduct stones, the empire's collapse continued, not with flames, but with forms: ledgers, stamps, and wax tablets. The machinery of the Roman grain supply, even in its final decades, was a testament to the power of administrative detail. When historians look at Rome's survival, they often focus on legions or emperors. But for the average Roman, the most critical institution may well have been the annona, and its decline left behind more than just empty stomachs. Let us imagine a citizen of Rome in the early 5th century, let's say around 420 CE. His name is not recorded in any triumphal inscription. He is not a senator or soldier. Perhaps he is a dockworker in Ostia or a clerk in a warehouse. For years, his life followed a predictable rhythm. Wake up, work, claim your grain ration, bake your bread. A system built on distant agriculture and state control ensured even the humblest citizen had some form of sustenance. The bureaucratic complexity behind this system was staggering. Each eligible citizen received a tessera frumentaria, a small token or tablet that granted access to monthly grain rations. These were often marked with the holder's registration and details of distribution zones. Clerks recorded names, quantities, even preferences. The empire's paper trail was meticulous until it was. Breaking the chain. As the Western Empire lost control of its provinces, the cracks in the food system became unbridgeable. Egypt, lost to the Eastern Empire, no longer shipped grain westward. Carthage, taken by the Vandals in 439, meant North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost. These were not just geopolitical events, they were logistical disasters. Letters between remaining Roman officials show increasing desperation. One surviving report details the grain reserve in Ostia in 442 CE as being enough for only 2 more months. Another, written by a regional bishop, appeals to Constantinople for grain support, noting the absence of bread, even for Holy Communion. The shift was gradual but devastating. First came ration cuts. What had once been monthly rations were issued every 6 weeks, then quarterly. The weight of grain per person was reduced. Some communities were simply removed from the distribution rolls altogether. And still, the officials tried to maintain the illusion of control. Clerks continued to issue tesserae, even when no grain remained. Mules pulled carts to empty storehouses. The great stone granaries stood, their walls echoing with the sounds of bureaucracy functioning in a vacuum. Adaptive administration. Interestingly, the administrative framework of the Annona didn't vanish entirely. As Rome weakened, its systems were absorbed or reimagined by local bishops and elites. In some regions, Christian authorities took over grain distribution using old Roman facilities. The church, already a central force in social life, began to manage what remained of public welfare. Bishops like Augustine of Hippo in North Africa took a keen interest in food supply. His letters are filled with references to logistics appealing for grain from wealthier towns, organizing ship routes, and managing bakeries. For him, feeding the faithful was as much a spiritual duty as a logistical one. This transition also marked a quiet but monumental shift, from state to church, from empire to enclave. The sacred replaced the civic. The food system of the empire was not preserved by government, but by communities held together by faith, tradition, and sheer necessity. The village economy reborn. One of the most enduring effects of the collapse of Rome's food logistics was the decentralization of agriculture. As long-distance trade became unsafe and inconsistent, communities turned inward. Urban elites, once dependent on imported delicacies and wines from distant provinces, retreated to rural villas. Many of these villas transformed into self-sustaining estates latifundia run by peasant labor and operating outside imperial control. The Roman countryside, once a network of massive estates feeding distant cities, began to resemble the manorial system that would dominate medieval Europe. Peasants no longer labored for surplus to be shipped to Rome, they now fed themselves and their local lords. These changes were not coordinated reforms, but survival adaptations. The transformation of grain-based economies into localized, subsistence systems marks one of the most significant yet underappreciated shifts in Western history. Life grew smaller, journeys shortened, flavors changed, preserving what was left. In a world without dependable trade, the importance of food preservation grew. Roman techniques salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting evolved and spread. Salt, once used sparingly, became essential. The empire's salt roads via salarii remained in use long after the decline of other infrastructure. Even culinary habits adapted. Where once fine Roman kitchens produced dishes of spiced fish sauces and honeyed dormice, simpler meals of grain porridge, pools, pickled vegetables, and coarse bread took their place. Cheese and dried legumes were common. The luxury of the imperial table gave way to practical meals based on what could be stored and reused. We must also consider how people thought about food. In an age of scarcity, the idea of feasting was imbued with spiritual overtones. Fasting became not just a religious act, but a social norm. In Christian writings of the time, gluttony was one of the gravest sins, a reflection, perhaps, of how rare overabundance had become. The knowledge carriers. Amid all this loss, certain communities preserved knowledge about food storage, cultivation, and distribution. Chief among them, the monastic orders. While the monks would rise to greater prominence later in the Middle Ages, even in the 5th and 6th centuries, their abbeys were becoming repositories of agricultural wisdom. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the early 6th century, includes detailed instructions about meals, food rations, gardening, and grain storage. Monks were instructed to plant vegetables, manage water supplies, and ensure that each brother had a full pound of bread daily. This wasn't merely spiritual discipline, it was logistical survival encoded as holy law. In this way, the monastic world began to replace the empire not with armies or tax laws, but with crop rotations, preserved scrolls, and steady harvests. While the Roman Empire fragmented, the seeds of a new agrarian society quietly took root behind monastery walls. The quiet echo. As we look at the last granaries of Rome, We find more than empty buildings, we find a blueprint for the transformation of an empire into a continent of villages. The collapse of Rome's food system was not the end of civilization. It was a metamorphosis. The Roman citizen who once relied on the annona may have ended his life on a patch of land outside the city, cultivating lentils and onions, trading eggs for salt, kneeling before a bishop instead of a bureaucrat. And while the marble cracked and roads wore down, he and millions like him continued. The last grain was not served in some grand banquet hall or under imperial decree. It was likely ground by hand, baked in a communal oven, and eaten with a quiet hope for next season's harvest. And this brings us to another question, perhaps the most human one of all. In a world collapsing around them, how did ordinary people decide what was still worth preserving? By the middle of the 6th century, Rome was no longer the center of the world, it wasn't even the center of Italy. Once the beating heart of an empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, it was now a faded shadow of its former self, clinging to memory, tradition, and scattered remnants of power. But people still lived there, and they still ate somehow. The last granaries had long been emptied. The great warehouses like the Horia Galbi, once capable of sustaining hundreds of thousands, now housed families, livestock, and rot. The imperial annona system was gone, but the knowledge it represented did not vanish entirely. What persisted in the absence of imperial infrastructure was something more fragmented, local, and deeply human. This is the story of what came after, of how post-imperial communities, urban and rural alike, preserved not only themselves but the essence of survival through food, ingenuity, ritual, and community memory. From dole to charity. In the post-imperial landscape, the role once filled by the Roman state was gradually absorbed by the Church. In Rome, the bishop, eventually known as the Pope, became not only a spiritual leader but a civic one. He organized alms, managed resources, negotiated with warlords, and crucially, fed the people. By the time of Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century, the papacy controlled vast tracts of land across Italy, known as the Patrimonium Petri, the patrimony of St. Peter. These estates produced grain, wine, and olive oil, much of which was distributed to the poor of Rome. Gregory's letters record shipments of grain from Sicily to Rome under papal oversight. Where once the emperor had overseen the logistics of empire, now the Church oversaw the logistics of mercy. The difference was subtle but profound. What had been a civic entitlement was now a spiritual gift. To receive grain was no longer the right of a citizen, but the grace of God dispensed through his earthly agents. Adaptation in the ruins. While the Church's estates and surviving villas provided some stability, it was the countless anonymous households and tiny villages across the Italian peninsula that did the real work of survival. In regions surrounding Rome, rural life changed drastically. Once prosperous farming estates owned by absentee aristocrats were gradually broken up. As long-distance trade died, self-sufficiency became the rule. Wheat cultivation declined. It was a fragile crop in uncertain times. Instead, hardier grains, barley, millet, rye became staples. These were less ideal for bread but easier to grow and store. Legumes like lentils and peas became more important, not just for protein, but for soil health. Crop rotation, once managed by imperial agronomists on massive estates, was now practiced by necessity and passed down orally, family to family. Livestock was kept in smaller numbers, closer to the home, protected from raiders and predators. Chickens, goats, and pigs became common sights in once-urban spaces. Archaeological evidence shows gardens sprouting inside former Roman forums. Public buildings were reused as barns, storehouses, even makeshift granaries. Urban life had become rural in every way but location. Preserving memory, not just food. While methods of food preservation like salting, fermenting, and drying remained essential, what was being preserved in the 6th and 7th centuries wasn't just meat or grain, it was memory. The Roman culinary tradition, recorded in texts like Apicius and household records, was no longer practiced in its full form, but bits of it survived. In monasteries, in the kitchens of isolated villas, and in oral traditions, recipes and techniques were remembered in fragments. Honey-sweetened sauces, fish preserved in amphorae, garum alternatives made from local herbs, all were signs that the Roman palate hadn't disappeared entirely. Monks played a crucial role here. They copied not only biblical texts, but sometimes practical ones, treatises on agriculture, plant medicine, and food preparation. Some of these texts, like the De Re Rustica by Columella, would survive the centuries and inform agricultural practices in the Carolingian world and beyond. The written word preserved more than scripture. It preserved how to plant, when to harvest, how to store grain safely, and how to prepare food during a season of want. These were not romantic survival guides, but pragmatic records passed down by candlelight in cold, damp scriptoriums. Local innovations. With the empire gone and no central authority to dictate standards, local innovation flourished in small, unnoticed ways. In mountainous regions, new terracing techniques allowed for cultivation on slopes previously considered useless. In flood-prone plains, communities built raised granaries on stilts, borrowing ideas perhaps from Germanic or Celtic traditions, but adapting them to Roman spaces. In some parts of Italy, hollowed-out amphorae were reused as underground silos, buried in shaded spots to preserve grain longer. In others, people built new types of ovens, simpler, smaller, and more fuel-efficient. The Roman fornax gave way to earth ovens that could be built and repaired by hand. Tools changed, too. The water mill, a rarity in classical Rome, became more common in late antiquity, especially in monastic communities. Where manpower was scarce, water turned grain into flour and spared people the exhausting work of hand milling. None of these changes were revolutionary in isolation, but together, they helped build a post-imperial food culture that could endure hard seasons and uncertain futures. Dignity and scarcity. What's most remarkable about this period isn't how much was lost, but how much was preserved, adapted, or reborn in humbler forms. Food remained a communal activity. People gathered to harvest, to bake, to store grain together. Festivals persisted, now overlaid with Christian meaning, but retaining ancient rhythms tied to sowing, reaping, and fermenting. Bread, the core of the Roman diet, continued to be symbolic not just of sustenance, but of identity. Though wheat bread became rarer, people still spoke of it as a standard of civilization. Even the poorest aspired to make white bread again someday. It became a kind of memory in dough, passed down in the hope of better years. The question of what people ate during the fall of Rome is inseparable from what they believed, feared, and hoped. In every crust of barley bread or clay jar of dried beans, there was a statement: we are still here. An empire of crumbs. By the 7th century, Rome was no longer the Rome of Caesar or Trajan. It was a city of saints, not senators. Its population had dwindled to a fraction, but it had not disappeared. It had adapted. The last granaries crumbled. The vast trade routes fell silent. But in monasteries, villages, and the homes of ordinary people, life and food continued. This wasn't the dramatic fall of a city. It was the slow molting of an old skin. An empire that once measured itself by the quantity of its wheat shipments and size of its state bakeries, now measured success in loaves of barley bread and peace between harvests. And that perhaps is the most enduring legacy, not the collapse, but the quiet continuation. So now we reflect on this. If survival is not always grand or heroic, but instead slow, stubborn, and anonymous, how many other forgotten triumphs of history are still buried beneath the dust of ruins? Story 2. The lifeline of preservation. You might not think much of a salt crystal. It's plain, common, unremarkable. Yet, in the centuries following the fall of Rome and for thousands of years before it held the power to preserve not just food, but life, economies, and entire civilizations. In the medieval world before refrigeration, before sterile packaging or freeze drying, two techniques kept hunger at bay when the fields lay fallow or the hunt came up empty: salt and smoke. This story isn't about warlords or kings. It's about butchers, fishers, and peasants. About barns filled with curing meats and seaside huts where fish dried under woven nets. It's about the dull, gritty labor that allowed food to last through winter, famine, and siege. And more profoundly, it's about how these simple methods quietly held society together when nearly everything else was falling apart. Why preservation mattered. To understand the importance of salt and smoke, you must first step into the mindset of a world ruled by seasons. In the early medieval period, roughly the 6th to 10th centuries, there were no supermarkets, no global shipping lanes, no canned goods. Everything you ate came from within walking distance. And it came, if you were lucky, only during specific months. Fresh meat was a rare luxury. Once an animal was slaughtered, its flesh would spoil within days unless it was eaten immediately or somehow preserved. There were only a few tools available to slow down rot, and two of the most accessible were salting and smoking. But these weren't just culinary choices. They were acts of survival strategy. Without them, communities faced starvation between harvests, especially during long winters or during the hungry gap, the late spring period when the previous year's food had been exhausted, but the new crops had not yet matured. Salted pork, smoked fish, dried beans, these were staples that made it possible to endure. And because survival depended on them, so too did local economies, trade routes, and even diplomacy. Salt, the ancient currency. Salt is a preservative because it pulls moisture out of food through osmosis, inhibiting the growth of bacteria. It's simple science, but in a world without microscopes or chemistry textbooks, it was understood only by experience and deeply respected. In the early Middle Ages, salt was often more valuable than gold. Roman roads like the Via Salaria, literally, the Salt Road, remained active long after imperial engineers had vanished. These roads connected inland communities to coastal saltworks or salt mines. There were three main sources of salt in medieval Europe. Sea salt, harvested by evaporating seawater in coastal pans. Rock salt, mined from natural salt deposits such as those found in the Alps. Brine springs, collected from naturally salty groundwater, then boiled down. Each method required labor, fuel, and infrastructure, and each supported its own network of traders, pack animals, and guards. Transporting salt was dangerous. Raiders targeted salt caravans for their high value. Control over salt routes gave local rulers economic leverage. Some towns, like Lüneburg in Germany or Hallstatt in Austria, owed their very existence to salt. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, a soldier's allowance for purchasing salt. It's no exaggeration to say salt funded armies, built castles, and shaped borders. The salting process. Once acquired, salt was applied with care. Meats were dry salted, rubbed thoroughly, and packed tightly in barrels or brine cured, submerged in salty water for days or weeks. Pork, the most common preserved meat, was favored for its fat content and availability. A well-cured ham could last the better part of a year. Preserving wasn't just about salting meat, though. Fish, especially herring and cod, was often salted and then dried, becoming lightweight and long-lasting. In some coastal villages, entire economies revolved around fish preservation. Herring cured in the North Sea found its way to inland monasteries. Salt cod, or bacalhau, traveled as far as Iberia and even the Mediterranean. Salted vegetables, too, were common. Cabbage was transformed into sauerkraut, sometimes unintentionally through fermentation. Olives, capers, and even certain fruits were brined to extend their shelf life. This wasn't gourmet cooking. It was coarse, intense, often pungent food. but it was food that lasted. That was the only thing that mattered. Smoke, the second line of defense. Where salt was scarce, or where people wanted to double their preservation, smoking offered another solution. Smoke contains compounds like formaldehyde and phenols that slow bacterial growth. Smoking also dries out the meat, making it harder for microbes to thrive. Smoking was more accessible than salt in some inland regions, especially where forests were abundant. Villagers constructed smokehouses, small sheds where meats could be hung over smoldering fires for days or weeks. The smoke flavor became a regional signature. Oak, beech, alder, and juniper were commonly used, each imparting its own aroma. Unlike salting, smoking required careful attention. Too much heat and the meat would cook, too little and it would spoil. The smoke had to circulate evenly. On cold nights, someone would need to tend the fire constantly, adjusting the airflow, watching for sparks. Smoked sausages, bacon, ham, and even cheese became common. In some parts of Eastern Europe, smoked meats formed the backbone of winter diets. And in monasteries where fasting rules often restricted fresh meat, smoked and salted fish became spiritual and physical nourishment. Storage and strategy. Preserved foods had to be stored carefully. In the early Middle Ages, few homes had cellars, but those that did used them for storing barrels of salted goods. Underground pits, clay jars sealed with wax, and wooden crates lined with straw all helped protect against moisture, rodents, and rot. In larger estates or monasteries, storage was strategic. A year's worth of food might be held in massive granaries or salt vaults. These supplies weren't just for consumption, they were political tools. A lord who could feed his tenants through winter gained loyalty. A bishop who distributed salted meat during famine earned reverence. And a warlord with a storehouse full of dried fish could negotiate peace or delay surrender. Even the calendar reflected food preservation. Slaughtering animals in late autumn when temperatures dropped became a ritual in itself. The timing wasn't arbitrary. Cold weather helped keep meat fresh while it cured. The period around Martinmas, November 11, became synonymous with preservation and preparation for winter. Taste of necessity. The preserved foods of the medieval world didn't always taste pleasant. Salted meat was tough, dry, and needed to be soaked before eating. Smoked foods had bitter edges and were often heavily charred, but they carried deep cultural meaning. For peasants, a slice of salted pork in mid-January was a reminder of a successful autumn slaughter. For monks, the taste of smoked herring in Lent was a sign of spiritual discipline. And for merchants, barrels of preserved fish represented income, survival, and risk. More than anything, these foods created continuity. In a world where the next harvest was never guaranteed, they offered insurance bite by bite. Closing thought. We often celebrate the grand innovations of history, printing presses, aqueducts, cathedrals. But what about the smokehouse, the salt pan, the brined barrel of fish that carried a village through the lean months? Salt and smoke may not seem heroic, but they represent something even more enduring. How much of civilization is held together not by invention, but by preservation? If preservation was the method, distribution was the necessity. Salt and smoke not only helped people survive, but they reshaped entire economies. In this second part of our story, we turn from the chemistry of survival to the logistics of life. Preserved food wasn't just eaten, it was traded, taxed, stored in times of plenty, and rationed in times of desperation. From the smoky huts of coastal fishers to the echoing chambers of medieval toll houses, salt and smoke quietly sustained the framework of early medieval society. This section explores how preserved food, especially salted fish and meat, became currency, diplomacy, and infrastructure, building an interdependent world in a time when fragmentation was otherwise the norm. Salt fish in the shape of trade. Let's start with the Hanseatic League, a loose confederation of merchant towns that emerged centuries after the fall of Rome. While it would reach its peak later in the Middle Ages, its foundations were already forming in the 9th and 10th centuries, driven by the trade of salted herring and cod. Why fish? Because fish, preserved properly, could travel far inland and remain edible for months. And not just edible, it was required. The Christian Church enforced fast days where meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. On such days, fish was the only permitted flesh, and salted fish was the only variety widely available year-round. This led to the development of entire towns centered around fish preservation. Scania, on the southern tip of Sweden, became a herring capital. During spawning season, the coastline was a frenzy of activity. Boats hauled in catches by the ton, workers immediately salted the fish in barrels, and traders from across Europe arrived to buy and ship them home. In places like York and Rouen, smoked eels and salt cod became urban staples. These products made their way into cities, monasteries, and even royal courts. In all of this, every transaction, every salt barrel loaded onto a cart was underpinned by the knowledge that preserved food was power. The salters, the fishers, and the smoke masters. Preservation became a specialized trade. In early medieval towns, you could find entire guilds or informal networks of salters, people who were responsible for applying salt in precise quantities to ensure meat or fish didn't spoil. It was a skill passed down through generations, requiring judgment, not measurement. Too much salt and the food became inedible. Too little and it rotted. Inconsistent salting could mean illness, economic loss, or even famine during winter. Smokehouses were equally technical. The selection of wood, control of heat, and air circulation all required daily care. In some regions, such as parts of Scandinavia or Germany, smokehouses were communal villages shared the space, using it in turn, ensuring every household had food for winter. By the 10th century, large estates had professional preservers on staff. In the Carolingian Empire, inventories of noble households included not only cattle and grain, but men skilled in the salting of meats. In this way, preservation was labor invisible perhaps in history books, but fundamental to survival. Salt as tax and toll. Salt itself became an object of governance. In fragmented post-Roman Europe, salt production was one of the few economic activities that rulers could reliably tax. The Salzburger region in the Eastern Alps, for instance, developed around rich salt mines. The very name Salzburg means salt fortress. Control of the mines translated to control of wealth. Princes and bishops competed for ownership. Workers labored underground in dangerous conditions, their output feeding markets hundreds of miles away. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax, was so central to royal revenue that it became one of the most hated taxes of the ancient regime, surviving well into the 18th century. But its roots lay in earlier medieval systems where access to salt defined your political and economic status. To pass through certain roads or bridges with a cart of salt or barrels of salted goods, one had to pay tolls. Entire legal systems evolved to track, regulate, and protect the salt trade. In an era where central authority was weak, control of salt routes was a reliable way to enforce power. Salt became a commodity of kings and commoners, both sacred and strategic. Preserved food and famine resilience. There is another reason salt and smoke mattered so much in this period. Famine was frequent and deadly. The early medieval climate was unstable. Known today as part of the late antique Little Ice Age, this period saw unpredictable growing seasons, late frosts, and failed harvests. Food surpluses were rare. Any method that extended shelf life was a hedge against the unpredictable. Monasteries and castles maintained storehouses where barrels of salted fish or pork were kept for lean times. In years of poor harvest, these stores could mean the difference between starvation and survival. But preserved food wasn't just stored, it was redistributed. In times of crisis, Rulers and bishops were expected to open their granaries and smokehouses. A well-stocked storehouse was a symbol of legitimacy. To feed the people was to prove one's right to rule. Even local lords were judged by their generosity in famine. Chronicles from the period mention lords gaining or losing favor, depending on how they shared salted meat during droughts or failed harvests. Famine relief became an essential part of early medieval politics, and salt and smoke made it possible. Monasteries, guardians of the barrel and the book. No discussion of early food preservation would be complete without turning again to the monasteries, which had already become centers of knowledge and agriculture. Monks, bound by strict rules of fasting and dietary abstention, relied heavily on preserved food. Monastic kitchens kept large supplies of salted and smoked fish to feed brothers during Lent and other fasting periods. But monasteries also preserved the knowledge of preservation itself. Texts from Carolingian monastic centers included recipes for brines, instructions for salting pork, and even prayers to say over the smokehouse. These were not cookbooks as we know them, but fragments tucked into agricultural treatises, letters, and inventories. The Capitulaire de Velies, a royal document attributed to Charlemagne, lists specific foodstuffs to be preserved and stored, and includes quantities of salt to be kept on royal estates. This was not flavoring, it was infrastructure. Salt, smoke, storage, and food redistribution were part of how early medieval rulers maintained their realm. Global connections in a salted world. Even in this fragmented age, preserved foods traveled across borders and cultures. Salted herring from the North Sea reached Italy. Iberian salt cod made its way to Gaul. Mediterranean olives in brine found their way into the kitchens of Frankish nobility. The Islamic world, with its advanced trade networks, contributed dried fruits, salted lemons, and innovations in spice preservation that slowly made their way north. Preservation techniques evolved as cultures exchanged ideas. In Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, salt curing was refined with spice mixtures. In Byzantium, vinegar-based preservation was common. Slavic peoples brought in fermentation methods that complemented salting. Salt and smoke made these global flows of food possible. Without preservation, trade would have collapsed. With it, communities that otherwise had little contact were connected one barrel at a time. Ending reflection. This was not a glamorous age. There were no great food feasts immortalized in literature, no celebrity chefs, no recorded menus from the peasants who worked by fire and salt. And yet without them, and without the labor of preserving each fish, each slab of pork, each handful of cabbage, we might never have reached modernity. It wasn't kings who preserved civilization. It was the ones who preserved the food. Which leads us to a sobering question. In a world always preparing for hunger, how did people measure wealth not in coin or conquest, but in calories that didn't rot? By the end of the first millennium, Europe had begun to change. Kingdoms solidified. Cities cautiously expanded. Agricultural technology crept forward, slowly improving yields. The immediate pressure of day-to-day survival began to ease in some regions, though never entirely. But even as the tools and systems advanced, the legacy of salt and smoke endured, deeply embedded in the rhythms of food, power, and culture. In this final section, we reflect on how these two humble preservation methods, tools of necessity and desperation, shaped the very infrastructure of medieval society, and left behind traditions that persist even into the modern era. Because while kings rose and fell and battles redrew maps, it was preserved food that allowed society to survive between harvests, through famine, and across borders. Institutions that remembered. As feudal systems expanded across Europe, many of the roles once held by itinerant traders or village smoke masters became formalized. Feudal lords and religious orders institutionalized food preservation. Royal charters from the 11th century describe the maintenance of communal ovens, salt works, and even rights to fish drying sites. Just as control of a mill meant control of flour, control of a salt spring or fish smokehouse meant economic power and social leverage. Monasteries continued to lead the way in record-keeping. In English abbeys such as Ely or Glastonbury, monks recorded annual purchases of salt by the barrel, noted repairs to smokehouses, and included preservation instructions in Latin glossaries. These were not exotic practices, they were the mundane habits of administration and survival. We also begin to see legal codes referencing preservation, not just as a right but as a duty. Tenants on certain lands owed rents in salted pork. Guild charters required apprentices to learn preservation methods. In some regions, food preservation became part of ritualized seasonal labor, with whole communities turning out for the slaughter season and the subsequent days of curing, brining, and smoking. By this time, preserving food had become more than a necessity, it was a cultural institution. The ritual of slaughter and preservation. Across medieval Europe, late autumn remained the season of slaughter and preservation. The slaughter of pigs, in particular, became a defining event for peasant households and large estates alike. In France, the Boucherie de November marked not just a chore, but a calendar moment. Families prepared for weeks, sharpening tools, repairing smokehouses, and boiling brine in large cauldrons. Every part of the animal was used not just out of thrift, but from cultural memory that remembered leaner times. Jowls were salted, intestines cleaned for sausage casing, lard rendered and stored. Cuts of meat were divided into portions for immediate consumption, others to be preserved. The smell of smoke clung to entire villages, mingling with wood ash and cold air. This was not simply sustenance. It was survival planning, it was community bonding, it was ritual. And while these activities seemed ordinary to those living them, they were the foundations of food security in a world where famine was never far away. From preserved food to preserved identity. As time passed, preserved foods took on symbolic meaning. They became not just emergency rations, but emblems of cultural heritage. Salt cod, once a means of surviving the winter, became a central dish in Iberian cuisine. Smoked ham and sausages became signatures of Germanic regions, tied to festivals and inheritance. Pickled vegetables in Eastern Europe retained associations with peasant thrift and resilience. Even the pungent, long-aged fish sauces of Scandinavia and the Baltic's descendants of early salted fish traditions persisted in cultural memory. These were not relics, they were living links to centuries of improvisation, endurance, and ingenuity. More than that, they became identity markers. In a world of shifting borders, the preserved food on one's table, its flavor, smell, preparation rooted people in place and history. Salt and smoke in global context. Though our focus has been on early medieval Europe, it's important to recognize that these methods were never unique to the West. In North Africa, Islamic scholars wrote treatises on preserving fruits and meats with salt, vinegar, and spices. In Asia, Chinese and Korean civilizations used salt fermentation extensively long before the term probiotic ever existed. In the Americas, indigenous peoples smoked fish and meat over open fires, burying them in pits to preserve them through harsh winters. This global commonality reminds us the need to preserve food is one of the most universal of human concerns. Wherever humans settled, they confronted the same basic problem: how to keep food edible when nature was not kind. Salt and smoke became their answer, an answer so effective it persisted across empires, languages, and continents. The quiet power of the barrel. In economic terms, preserved food allowed for trade over distance, surplus storage, and famine relief. In social terms, it enabled hospitality, gift-giving, and celebration in lean seasons. In political terms, it gave rulers leverage, lords responsibility, and the church a means of both nourishment and control. But in human terms, it gave people a future. A salted ham hanging in a smoky loft meant there would be food in January. A brined barrel of herring arriving from the coast meant meals for an entire town. A smoked sausage in a peasant's pouch was proof of planning, patience, and persistence. Preserved food didn't just fill stomachs. It shaped expectations, gave hope, and carved a rhythm into rural life that endured for centuries. Fatting into convenience. Today, we rarely consider salt or smoke as tools of survival. Refrigerators hum quietly in every home. Supermarkets offer strawberries in winter and fresh fish hundreds of miles from the sea. The convenience has distanced us from the rituals of preservation. But even now, the echoes remain. We salt our holiday hams. We eat smoked salmon at brunch. We pickle cucumbers and cure bacon. We enjoy the flavor but seldom remember the context. These foods were never meant to be luxurious. They were meant to carry us through the worst. Final reflection. As we conclude this quiet tale, one shaped not by the clamor of battle but by the hiss of smoke and the crunch of salt, we look back with respect not just for the method, but for the minds that honed it, the hands that practiced it, and the generations that passed it down in silence. Because sometimes, history isn't preserved in books. It's preserved in barrels. So we ask, in the spirit of quiet reflection, when the future seemed uncertain, how did the humblest practices, the salted, the smoked, the stored, end up preserving more than just food? How did they preserve civilization itself? Story 3. The Quiet Revolution of the Monastic Table. If you were to travel back to early medieval Europe, let's say the 8th century, and walk through the gates of a Benedictine monastery at dawn, what would you hear? Not bells ringing triumphantly, not sermons echoing across stone cloisters. Instead, you'd likely hear the slow creak of a water wheel turning, the rhythmic groan of grindstones, the shuffling of sandals on worn stone paths as monks moved silently to their daily labor. This was a world defined not by opulence or warfare, but by routine, regulation, and ration. In this story, we explore how monastic communities, guided by spiritual discipline and grounded in agricultural pragmatism, became the quiet engines of food innovation, preservation, and redistribution during the so-called Dark Ages. Their influence on food security, communal eating, and technological adaptation was far greater than we often acknowledge. These were not merely ascetic men devoted to prayer, they were organizers, cooks, millers, brewers, and stewards of survival. Entering the monastery. Monasteries were often situated away from cities in valleys, on hillsides, or near rivers where solitude could be maintained and self-sufficiency pursued. These locations were chosen carefully, not just for silence and reflection, but for access to water, arable land, and building materials. Each monastery was a contained world. With walls enclosing gardens, bakeries, storehouses, and mills, the monastic compound operated as its own microeconomy. Unlike feudal estates reliant on peasant labor, monasteries were largely staffed by their own members, ora et labora, said the rule of Saint Benedict, pray and work. And central to that work was feeding the community. The rule of Saint Benedict, diet as discipline. Written around the year 516 CE, the Rule of Saint Benedict is a foundational document in Western monasticism. Though brief compared to imperial law codes, it offered detailed guidance on how monks should eat, fast, and prepare food. Here what it prescribed: 2 meals per day, one around midday, the other in the evening. No meat from 4-legged animals for monks living within the cloister, unless ill. 1 pound of bread per day. Cooked vegetables and legumes, especially beans and lentils. Wine allowed in moderation, if water alone was not feasible. Meals should be taken in silence, with one monk reading aloud from scripture or religious texts while the others ate. The meals weren't meant to satisfy indulgence, they were meant to sustain the body for prayer and labor. Yet even within this minimalism, there was balance. The rule acknowledged regional variations, climate, and individual needs. Flexibility, not austerity, preserved the health of the community. The refectory, where body and spirit met. The refectory, or monastic dining hall, was a sacred space. Long wooden tables arranged in rows, stone or clay bowls, wooden spoons, and often no conversation at all. Eating was not communal entertainment, it was communal sustenance, a literal act of shared survival. A designated reader, the lector, stood at a pulpit, reading aloud. This ensured that even during meals, the mind remained focused on the divine. It also created a discipline of rhythm. Chew slowly, listen carefully, pass the bread in silence. Food was prepared in a central kitchen, often adjacent to a bakery and brew room. Large ovens baked daily loaves. Copper cauldrons simmered beans, grains, and porridge. On special days, preserved fish or simple cheese might be served. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were stored carefully or distributed to the poor at the gate. Feeding the body through technology. The rise of the monastic mill. Nowhere is the practical genius of monastic life clearer than in their embrace of technology to support food production, especially the mill. In Roman times, water mills had existed but were rarely widespread. Monastic communities reinvigorated and expanded the use of water-powered mills across Europe. By the 8th century, monasteries were some of the largest mill owners in Europe. Why? Because grinding grain by hand with quernstones was laborious, slow, and exhausting. A watermill could process enough flour in a day to feed hundreds, freeing up time for other tasks and reducing the burden on elderly or sick monks. The wheel and grinding mechanism became central to monastic farms. Some monasteries built canals or redirected streams to ensure year-round flow. Others maintained both water and windmills to hedge against seasonal change. These innovations weren't shared through grand proclamations but through quiet replication. As monks traveled between abbeys, they shared designs, improvements, and practical advice. Over time, entire rural economies began to copy monastic methods, eventually embedding mills in villages across Europe. Monastic brewing and fermentation. Water in early medieval Europe could be unsafe to drink, especially in cities. Though monasteries were often built near clean sources, they didn't rely entirely on them. Instead, they turned to beer and fermented drinks, both for nutrition and hydration. Monastic brewing was not an indulgence, it was nourishment. The monks often drank a low-alcohol beer known as small beer, which was safe, filling, and packed with calories. In fasting seasons, it was sometimes called liquid bread. Brewing was carefully overseen. Malted barley or wheat was used. Hops were not yet common everywhere. Herbs like gruit, a mix of bog myrtle, yarrow, and rosemary, were used for flavor and preservation. The beer was brewed in large quantities and stored in barrels, often in cool, subterranean cellars. This practice spread beyond the cloister. By the 10th century, monastic beer had become a respected export, requested by nobles and bishops alike. The same applied to monastic cheese, another preserved food born of necessity and patience. Feeding the poor. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of monastic food production was charity. Every Benedictine monastery was expected to give alms and food to the poor who came to their gates. This was not optional. It was part of the rule. Leftovers from meals, surplus bread, extra stew, salted fish, all were distributed daily. On feast days, the quantities increased. Poor relief was part of the monastery's identity, a bridge between the cloister and the wider world. Some larger monasteries kept guest houses and soup kitchens specifically for this purpose. Records from Monte Cassino, Fulda, and Cluny show hundreds of daily recipients at certain times of year, particularly during Lent and Advent. In this way, monasteries were more than isolated spiritual centers. They were emergency food banks, kitchens, bakeries, and breweries, quietly serving as social safety nets in a fragmented and often famine-prone society. Closing thought. The image of a monk grinding grain or pouring broth into a wooden bowl might not appear heroic. It's not the stuff of epic sagas. But in a world where kingdoms collapsed, crops failed, and uncertainty was constant, these quiet, cloistered men created something dependable, a rhythm of work, prayer, and meal that provided more than spiritual comfort. It provided sustenance. And yet, we're left with a question that the rule itself seems to ask between the lines. When survival becomes a discipline and food becomes a ritual, can a meal feed the soul as much as the body? As Europe moved deeper into the Middle Ages, the monastic system did something extraordinary. It scaled. It grew without conquest. It replicated not through war or decree, but through land grants, pilgrims, piety, and the spread of the rule of Saint Benedict. With each new abbey or priory came more fields, more bread ovens, more cellars, and more mouths to feed, both inside and outside the cloister. This section explores the expanding role of monasteries as food producers, land managers, and quiet revolutionaries in how food was grown, processed, preserved, and shared. These weren't institutions working in isolation. They became central hubs in a rural Europe still recovering from collapse. Behind the quiet walls of monastic life, a new model for agrarian society was taking root. Monasteries as landowners. By the 9th century, powerful nobles and kings across Europe were granting land to monasteries. These donations were meant to secure favor with God or atone for sins, but they had very real material outcomes. A monastery didn't simply pray over its land. It worked it. It organized it. It mapped and cultivated it with precision and patience. Monasteries became some of the largest and most efficient landowners in Europe, often managing dozens of fields, orchards, vineyards, pastures, and woodlands. Monks cataloged their holdings in detailed inventories known as polyptychs. These documents recorded not just land area, but what crops were grown, which fields were rotated, what animals were kept, what rents or goods were owed by peasants, how much bread, cheese, ale, and meat was produced and stored. These were early blueprints for sustainable food economies, maintained with a level of order and foresight rarely seen elsewhere at the time. The grange system, remote food production. Not every piece of monastic land could be cultivated by monks themselves. Some holdings were far from the main cloister, requiring a different system, the grange. A grange was a monastic farm, often staffed by lay brothers, monks who focused on labor rather than liturgy, or local peasants under contract. These satellite farms followed monastic principles but operated semi-independently, with regular shipments of grain, cheese, salted meat, or ale sent back to the mother abbey. The grange system allowed monasteries to diversify production across different climates and soil types, maintain redundancy in case of local crop failure, reduce overdependence on a single food source, feed both monks and the surrounding population. It also helped spread technical knowledge. As lay workers learned monastic methods, they passed them to their children and neighbors. Techniques like crop rotation, drainage, and manure management filtered into the broader rural economy through repeated exposure, not through formal teaching, but through work. Agricultural innovation and food security. While monks did not invent farming, they did standardize and improve upon existing practices. Among their contributions, three-field rotation, a variation of Roman systems, planting one field with winter crops, one with spring crops, and letting the third lie fallow to recover. Improved plow design, particularly in wetter, heavier soils of northern Europe, Monks adopted and spread the heavy-wheeled plow with iron plowshares and a coulter to cut the soil. Beekeeping, for wax and honey, especially in monasteries that prohibited sugar, which was not yet widely available. Herb gardens, carefully cultivated for both cooking and medicine. Storage barns with raised floor to reduce moisture and rot. All of this contributed to greater food security, not only for monks, but for the surrounding villages that depended on the monastery for seasonal work, charity, and refuge during famine or war. In times of scarcity, it was often monastic storehouses that sustained the community. In times of plenty, the same storehouses became points of exchange, supporting local markets. Monks and the marketplace. Though monks lived by vows of poverty, monasteries often accumulated considerable wealth, especially from their agricultural surplus. The rule permitted trade only as needed, but that need became increasingly frequent as abbeys grew in scale. By the 10th and 11th centuries, some monasteries were actively involved in selling ale, cheese, salted fish, and honey, renting out their mills to nearby villagers for a fee, hosting weekly markets on monastery grounds, trading surplus grain in nearby towns. At first glance, this may seem at odds with their spiritual mission, but to the monks, orderly commerce was another form of discipline. It enabled charitable giving, funded expansion, and supported other monasteries in need. Moreover, by managing these transactions ethically and with written records, they introduced a form of regulated, fair trade in places where chaos and exploitation were otherwise common. Food and the liturgical calendar. Monastic life followed the liturgical year, a seasonal cycle of feasts and fasts that shaped daily eating habits. This calendar had real implications for food production and storage. Fasting days, sometimes up to half the year in stricter orders, restricted meat, dairy, and even eggs. This increased demand for preserved fish, especially pickled or salted, legumes for protein, bread and beer as calorie sources. Thus, food had to be planned months in advance, with reserves set aside for religious observance as much as seasonal need. Cooking itself was a sacred rhythm, adapting to each feast day and abstention period. Special breads were baked for saints' days. Honey was saved for Easter cakes. Herbs were dried for Advent stews. Even within their constraints, monks cultivated culinary traditions that echoed long after the meal ended. The cloister as model. By the 11th century, the monastic system had spread across Europe, from Ireland to Italy, from England to the German principalities. Each abbey became a center of agricultural, technological, and culinary practice. Kings and nobles often modeled their own estate management on the monastic example. In the Capitulaire de Villiers, Charlemagne's administrators adopted monastic terminology and expectations for food reserves, orchards, mills, and gardens. Why? Because it worked. The monastery, with its mills, granges, ovens, and orderly eating, offered stability in an unstable world. It showed what was possible when labor was structured, when meals were regulated, when surplus was managed with foresight rather than panic. A quiet transformation. This wasn't a revolution in the modern sense. There was no banner raised over a barricade, no declarations or manifestos. It was a gradual reweaving of society around reliable food, ethical labor, and communal support. The humble monastic table, silent, wooden, set with bowls of beans and bread, did more than feed monks. It fed ideas. Ideas of equity, of dignity in labor, of food as a shared sacred act. Unresolved thought. And so we arrive at a quiet question, shaped by fields plowed in silence and loaves broken without fanfare. If the monastery was a world apart, how did its table end up feeding the world beyond its walls? There are few places in the medieval world where food, faith, and infrastructure intersected so seamlessly as in the monastery. Behind the silence of cloister walls was a kind of revolution, not the loud kind driven by swords and speeches, but a revolution of routine, of rhythm, and of resourcefulness. In this final section, we follow the story to its quiet climax, how monastic food systems didn't just sustain monks, but influenced the very foundations of European society, from farming practices and economic policies to cultural memory and even modern culinary traditions. Let's now trace the final threads of this influence, not with fireworks, but with flour, fermentation, and faith. The cloister's influence beyond its walls. By the 12th century, monasteries had become hubs of agricultural efficiency, often outproducing the rural villages around them. But more importantly, they set standards. Their records, methods, and habits were copied and passed along. Mills, once exclusive to cloisters and castles, became village fixtures. Crop rotation and seasonal planning, formalized in monastic documents, entered secular farming handbooks. Orchards and vineyards, once purely utilitarian, were managed with increasing sophistication, inspired by monastic care. Herding patterns, such as the rotation of pigs through oak groves to feed on acorns, known as pannage, were modeled after monastic schedules. In this way, monasteries became the agricultural textbooks of the Middle Ages, not through theory, but through example. Their influence reached royalty. Carolingian rulers employed monastic stewards to manage royal estates. Bishops consulted abbots on land management. Noble sons, educated in monasteries, carried those principles back into the secular world. And gradually, a continent reshaped by war began to rediscover stability, planted one seed at a time. The culinary memory of monasticism. Even today, echoes of monastic food culture remain. Many of Europe's beloved foods began as monastic staples. Trappist and Benedictine beers, brewed under strict quality control and still produced today in abbeys across Belgium and France. Cheeses like Munster, Terte de Moine, and Saint Nectaire, all developed in monasteries for long storage and trade. Herbal liqueurs such as Chartreuse, first distilled by monks for medicinal and digestive use. Dark, dense breads made from rye or spelt, the legacy of the monastic bakery, where loaves were hearty, nourishing, and intended to last. Pottage and bean stews, flavored with simple herbs, remain the base of many traditional European soups. Even the table lay out the idea of shared benches, communal bowls, and bread passed hand to hand owes much to the monastic refectory. Modern farm-to-table dining, with its emphasis on locality, seasonality, and minimal waste, would feel familiar to a monk from the year 900. Their worldview was not commercial but practical, and that practicality shaped not just how food was made, but how it was respected. Writing it all down, the hidden scribes of agriculture. Much of what we know about early medieval food systems comes not from merchants or kings, but from monastic scribes. These monks, tasked with copying books and recording daily affairs, left behind inventories of crops, livestock, and tools, ledgers tracking food distribution to poor families, brew logs noting fermentation cycles, recipes for medicinal broths, herbal tonics, and preserved fruits, seasonal planting guides and calendars. These weren't bestsellers. They were administrative tools, yet they survive in abbey archives and form the quiet backbone of historical agriculture today. Monks didn't seek credit. Their meals weren't meant to impress. But in preserving their knowledge and practicing it daily, they bridged the gap between classical agriculture and medieval survival. The decline and diffusion. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, monasteries changed. Some grew immensely wealthy, their refectories filled with finer foods. Others declined, corrupted by politics or distant from the needs of the poor. New orders like the Cistercians attempted to return to simplicity, building austere monasteries in remote places and doubling down on agricultural labor. By the 14th century, famine, plague, and secularization would weaken many of these institutions. Yet even as monastic influence waned, their systems remained embedded in rural life. Tithe of grain to churches replaced centralized storage. Parish-run ovens replaced the cloistered bakery. Village mills, once rented from the abbey, became self-managed. Charitable food distribution became the responsibility of civic institutions. The monastery was no longer the center of rural economy, but its shadow remained, especially in the rhythms of how food was grown, stored, and shared. The moral table. What distinguished the monastic approach wasn't just efficiency, it was the ethic behind the economy. Meals were taken in silence, not to discourage joy, but to encourage contemplation. Bread was baked not just for sustenance, but as symbol of Christ, of labor, of sharing. Waste was discouraged not from scarcity alone, but from the belief that to waste was to sin against creation. This idea that food carries moral weight was monastic in origin and eventually diffused into Christian thought more broadly. Fasting became more than ritual. It was reflection. Eating became a discipline of gratitude and moderation. Even today, ideas about ethical consumption, conscious eating, and food justice echo the old monastic ideal, that meals, like prayers, should be mindful. The final crust. So what remains of this quiet food revolution? Perhaps it's in the restored monastery gardens, where herbs still grow between cloisters. Perhaps it's in the barrel of ale brewed under a stained glass window. Perhaps it's in the stone mill, turned by a reconstructed water wheel in a museum village. Or perhaps it's simply in the way we break bread with care, with intention, and with others. The monastic table, simple though it was, changed the course of European food history. It fed the hungry, it taught discipline, it resisted waste, and it reminded a fragile continent that to eat well is to live well, even in silence. Closing reflection. The monastery never conquered cities, commanded armies, or crowned kings. Yet its rhythms of prayer and porridge, of kneading and kindness, reshaped how Europe thought about labor, land, and the table. So we end with this final thought. In an age of chaos, could it be that the most revolutionary act was a silent meal? Story 4. The Famine of 536, Year Without a Summer. The year 536 CE began like many others in the early medieval world, quiet, cold, and uncertain. In villages from Ireland to Byzantium, farmers waited for spring, for growth, for warmth. But something was wrong. The sky dimmed, the frost stayed longer, crops failed, and then the hunger began. This is the story of a global environmental catastrophe, a mysterious event that plunged much of the known world into a prolonged, eerie twilight. It's not the story of emperors or generals, but of farmers, villagers, monks, and merchants who watched the world shift beneath their feet and tried, in quiet desperation, to survive. For many, the year 536 marked the beginning of a long, slow disaster, one that tested the limits of food production, social cohesion, and human endurance. A year unlike any other. What exactly happened in 536? Contemporary accounts describe it in chilling terms. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. In Ireland, the annals report a failure of bread. In China, summer frosts ruined harvests and led to mass starvation. In Mesopotamia, a dense fog hung in the air for months. What these sources describe is now understood by modern science as a volcanic winter, likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere, possibly in Iceland or North America. The eruption sent aerosols into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and altering weather patterns worldwide. Tree rings from Ireland to Siberia show drastically stunted growth. Ice cores from Greenland reveal layers of volcanic debris. The earth, quite literally, darkened, and with it, the lives of millions. The death of the harvest. For communities already living on the edge of subsistence, the results were catastrophic. Without sunlight, photosynthesis slowed. Crops did not ripen. In high-altitude regions, snow fell in summer. Fields of barley, wheat, and millet either failed entirely or yielded too little to store. By autumn of 536, granaries were running dry. What had been set aside for winter was now used to get through summer. In places like Gaul, Britain, and the Balkans, even minor crop loss could trigger famine. But this was not minor, this was systemic. Villagers were forced to slaughter livestock early, trading meat for grain or simply to delay hunger. But without grain, even animals starved. Oxen, the engines of plowing, were eaten, leaving fields unprepared for the next season. Soon the stored reserves of salted meat, smoked fish, and dried beans were exhausted. The hunger grew. Monasteries and the memory of plenty. In monastic communities, the crisis was keenly felt but also carefully recorded. At Monte Cassino, the monks kept weather logs alongside religious events. They noted shortened daylight, poor barley yields, and excess deaths among the brethren. Monasteries, which relied on routine and order, struggled to adapt. Fasting seasons became involuntary. Charitable food programs faltered. Yet some monasteries became beacons of resilience, using preserved goods, careful rationing, and herbal gardens to feed not just themselves but starving villagers. These were the quiet heroes of the famine, men who baked bread from chestnut flour, who taught crop substitution, who distilled barley into gruel and distributed it from wooden ladles to lines of the emaciated. In these places, faith met pragmatism and lives were saved. Collapse at the margins. While monasteries offered temporary relief, the famine hit hardest on the fringes in remote villages, highland communities, and border zones. In Scandinavia, entire settlements were abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows a sudden decline in habitation during the 530s and 540s, with a slow recovery over the next century. These weren't wars or migrations. They were famines, and the land was silent. In Ireland, the written record speaks of 3 years without bread. In Britain, already fractured by the withdrawal of Roman administration, the famine deepened political fragmentation. Small kingdoms rose and fell, unable to feed their people. Even in Byzantium, the most powerful empire of the day, food riots broke out. Grain ships from Egypt were delayed or failed entirely. Prices soared. Procopius recorded not just dim skies, but unrest in the marketplaces. In all these places, hunger was a political force, adapting in darkness. But people did adapt out of desperation, yes, but also through knowledge and resilience. Chestnuts, acorns, and wild roots were ground into flour. Fish traps and weirs were used more aggressively in rivers and estuaries. Fungi and mosses normally avoided were boiled and eaten. Nettles rich in nutrients were used in soups. In some regions, bog iron tools were repurposed to dig wild tubers. These adaptations weren't glamorous. They didn't stave off famine entirely, but they offered weeks, sometimes months of survival, enough for children to grow, for fields to be replanted, for spring to come if it ever would. A crisis with no name. Modern scholars call it the late antique Little Ice Age. But to those who lived through it, there was no name, just endless gray and hunger. Even today, we lack precise global death tolls. Famine mortality was rarely recorded outside cities, but the consequences were long-lasting. Birth rates plummeted for over a decade. Trade networks weakened. Political boundaries shifted. The Justinian plague, which began in 541, found a population already starved and vulnerable. It's possible that the volcanic eruption of 536 set the stage for one of the deadliest pandemics in history. A hungry body is a weak body. A famine is a welcome mat for disease. The psychological toll. It's easy to count crop failures, harder to measure fear. For people of the 6th century, the sky was a divine canvas. When it changed, so did their understanding of the world. Did God turn away? Was the sun being punished? Was the world ending? Priests and monks scrambled to explain the darkened skies with apocalyptic scripture. Pagan communities revived old rituals, hopping to appease unseen powers. In every community, faith was tested, often reshaped by the hunger and cold. These years carved deep emotional wounds, some remembered in writing, others only in the whispered prayers of the starving. Unfinished thought. So the year 536 passed into 537, and then 538. The skis slowly cleared, but the scars remained in the stomach, in the land, in the stories told by those who survived. And we're left to ask, when nature turned hostile and the sun disappeared, what was left to believe in if not the harvest? The skis that dimmed in 536 did not brighten quickly. For 2, possibly 3 years, the world remained cloaked in a dull haze, the sun casting a pale light even at noon. Temperatures dropped across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed repeatedly. Famine persisted, shifting from immediate crisis to enduring scarcity. In this section, we move deeper into the story, not just the event of the volcanic winter itself, but its long-term aftermath. We trace how the initial environmental shock rippled outward through agriculture, trade, religion, and even geopolitics, dragging Europe and much of the known world into a decade of hardship. What happens when hunger isn't a season but a generation? The echo of the event. By 537, communities had begun to realize that the conditions of the previous year were not an anomaly, they were the new normal. In many parts of Europe and Asia, this realization came too late. The second year of failed harvests was in many ways worse than the first. Reserves had been spent. Seed grain had been eaten. Tools were worn down, and oxen crucial for plowing had been slaughtered for food. Fallow fields grew weeds. The agricultural cycle had been broken, and restarting it required time, labor, and above all, hope. Some villages never recovered. Archaeological sites from Scandinavia, the British Isles, and parts of the Frankish countryside show long-term abandonment in the late 530s and 540s. Burial grounds increased in density. Forests reclaimed pastures. In some cases, entire regions may have seen population reductions of 30–50%. This was not a single-year crisis. It was a systemic failure, prolonged by environmental, economic, and social feedback loops. The breakdown of exchange. In the ancient world, cities survived by importing food. Rome had once depended on grain from Africa and Egypt. Constantinople thrived on its supply routes. But after 536, those routes became less predictable. Delayed shipments, storms, and poor harvests in source regions all contributed to urban shortages. In Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, grain prices skyrocketed. The imperial government attempted to stabilize supply through emergency distribution, but even an empire can only store so much. When the poor rioted, guards were forced to defend bakeries and grain stores. In Gaul and the post-Roman West, the situation was more localized. Without central authority, regional food systems failed. Roads were impassable. Trade fairs were abandoned. Villages hoarded rather than traded. The system of mutual exchange, already weakened by the collapse of Roman logistics, fragmented into insular survival. Coins from this period show a decrease in circulation. Metal hoards increase. Why? Because food had replaced silver as the most valuable currency. In famine years, a handful of beans was worth more than a minted coin. The search for new foods. As traditional staples disappeared, communities turned to alternatives, some nutritious, others dangerous. Nuts, acorns, and chestnuts were ground into flour. In parts of Italy and Gaul, this became the basis of famine bread. Wild greens and nettles, rich in vitamins, were boiled into thin stews. Mushrooms and lichen, normally avoided due to risk, were consumed, sometimes with lethal consequences. Dog meat and even human flesh appear in some accounts not widespread, but real and horrifying to those who recorded it. In one chilling entry, the Chronicle of John of Ephesus notes that parents devoured their children during the famine. Whether literal or hyperbolic, the very inclusion of such a detail reflects the psychological depths of hunger. Some monks recorded recipes for emergency bread, a mixture of ground fava beans, sour wild barley, and whatever herbs could be found. These recipes were practical and spiritual, meant to preserve life without violating fasting rules. Disease and despair. Hunger alone was deadly, but hunger also made people vulnerable to disease. Malnutrition weakens the immune system. When combined with crowded conditions, refugees fleeing famine regions, people huddled in monasteries or abandoned villas, the result was predictable: epidemic disease. It is no coincidence that the Justinian plague emerged in this same period, beginning in 541. Though likely of bubonic origin, its rapid spread and high mortality were enabled by decades of demographic weakening. In other words, the famine set the stage. It didn't just kill, it prepared the body for the next blow. Some historians now refer to the combined period of 536–550 as a double crisis: environmental catastrophe followed by pandemic collapse. Together, they brought an end to what little remained of the classical economic and social order. Monastic memory and the liturgical lens. As the crisis deepened, monks and clerics struggled to make sense of it. The dim sun, the failed crops, the dying children, how could this be explained? Many turned to biblical models. Like the 7 years of famine in Egypt, perhaps this was divine punishment. Like Job, perhaps the world was being tested. Perhaps Christ's second coming was near. The liturgical calendar was reshaped. Prayers for rain were replaced with prayers for light. Days of fasting became indistinguishable from days of starvation. The line between spiritual discipline and physical suffering blurred. Monastic records from this period often describe the weather as a moral event. The sun had dimmed, they believed, because of human sin, especially pride, gluttony, and war. It's important to note, this was not superstition in the way we sometimes assume. In a world without modern science, linking environmental collapse to human behavior was both logical and emotionally necessary. Innovation amid adversity. Yet even in the darkest times, some communities adapted and even innovated. In the Alps and Apennines, transhumance, the seasonal movement of livestock between mountain and valley pastures, was intensified as communities sought new grazing lands when old ones failed. In Scandinavia, early forms of ice storage appeared, using deep pits filled with snow to preserve salted fish longer into summer. In coastal regions, fishing took on greater importance. In parts of Ireland and Britain, archaeological evidence shows increased consumption of shellfish, including limpets and mussels, often overlooked in better times. Some monasteries began experimenting with grain substitutes like emmer, and spelt ancient grains more tolerant of poor weather. Each of these changes was small, but taken together, they reveal a pattern of resilience, not of heroic resistance, but of quiet persistence. A shorter life, a longer shadow. By the late 540s, the sun had begun to shine again. Yields improved. Trees resumed normal growth, but the scars remained. People who had lost children, homes, villages, they carried trauma. The average lifespan dipped for decades. Birth rates took years to recover, and even as the weather improved, the old patterns had been broken. Some scholars believe this period marked the final tipping point between antiquity and the medieval world. The post-Roman order, already fractured, was now irreparably altered. The classical city declined. Rural life, centered around small communities and monasteries, became the norm. The economy became local, subsistence-based, and conservative. The famine did not just kill crops, it killed confidence in the systems of the past. Closing thought. In all this, we see that the famine of 536 was more than a climatic anomaly. It was a civilizational reckoning, one that transformed not just how people ate, but how they thought about the world. And so we ask, when the future feels uncertain, do we return to the past or begin inventing something entirely new? By the 550s, the light had begun to return. The long shadow of the volcanic winter receded slowly, stubbornly, like a fog lifting from the land. Trees put out new leaves. Crops grew again hesitantly, then abundantly. But the world that emerged from the famine of 536 was not the same one that had entered it. This final section closes the story of the year without a summer by examining what remained the social, agricultural, and emotional legacy of the famine, and how it subtly redefined Europe's trajectory in the centuries to come. It is a story not of triumphant recovery, but of hard-won resilience, not of rebirth, but of quiet reconstruction. It is the story of those who survived the silence, and how they carried their memories forward, sometimes in writing, sometimes in bread. The return of the light. After nearly a decade of disrupted weather, stunted crops, and social breakdown, records begin to show signs of recovery by the late 540s and into the 550s. Tree rings widen again, indicating improved growing conditions. Harvest records, where they exist, begin to increase in quantity. Trade routes, long dormant, start to stir back to life. But recovery was not immediate. Soil fertility had been damaged, tools were broken, fields lay fallow, and populations were depleted. It would take generations to regain what had been lost. In some regions, especially northern Europe, the famine seems to have permanently reduced the rural population, allowing forests to reclaim once cultivated land. But in other areas, especially the Mediterranean, repopulation occurred more quickly. Still, even in the face of improving weather, scarcity remained the default mindset. A memory in every meal. Food habits changed after the famine, some temporarily, others permanently. Barley and rye, once considered secondary grains, became staples. Their hardiness made them safer crops in uncertain climates. Bread recipes simplified, often using less yeast or none at all. Flatbreads, porridges, and gruels became more common. Fermentation and preservation practices, refined during the crisis, continued, especially pickling, drying, and salting. Communities kept larger grain reserves, even in good years, wary of the sky turning gray again. These were not just economic choices, they were cultural imprints, the sort of changes that outlived the generation that made them. Fear lives long in the kitchen. Monasteries, having weathered the famine with relative success, codified many of these adaptations into their daily rules. Recipes using chestnut flour or wild herbs entered formal practice. Fasting calendars incorporated greater flexibility. Even religious services included prayers explicitly referencing the time of great cold and the years of hunger. The children of the famine. Every famine has its survivors, and those survivors carry memories, traumas, and lessons into the next generation. In the 550s and 560s, children born during or just after the famine entered adulthood. Their worldview was different. They had seen or heard what it was like to live through darkness. Many had lost parents, siblings, or entire villages. This generation often deferred risk. They married later, planted more conservatively, kept more animals even if it meant less immediate grain production. In legal documents, this caution appears as increased communal storage clauses, shared ownership of oxen, and careful subdivision of fields. They also remembered who had helped them and who had not. Trust was reshaped. Monasteries, in particular, gained lasting respect as centers of aid, protection, and sustenance. This contributed to the growing political and spiritual power of the Church, especially in the West, rebuilding society from the ground and soil up. While the famine broke many systems, it also forced innovation. With much of Roman infrastructure gone or decayed, survivors had to rebuild from local knowledge. We see the early signs of what would become the medieval village. Fields organized into strips for shared labor. Mills run collectively or by monastic supervision. Food production tied to feast and fasting calendars, shaping both economy and liturgy. The widespread adoption of rotational cropping, possibly influenced by monastic land management. The famine revealed that long-distance dependency was dangerous. It created a culture of hyperlocalism, where food, faith, and governance grew closer together. In this way, the catastrophe of 536 inadvertently accelerated the shift from Roman urbanism to medieval agrarianism. The spiritual interpretation. For the chroniclers and clergy, the famine was never just environmental, it was theological. Even as the skies cleared, they continued to write about it not in terms of nature, but in terms of divine will. Bishops delivered sermons comparing the famine to biblical trials, the flood, the plagues of Egypt, the locusts of Joel. In some cases, these interpretations led to new policies. More frequent almsgiving in good years. The establishment of church granaries for famine relief. The encouragement of simpler diets, even in wealthy homes. This was not just religious posturing. It was a way of remembering suffering and embedding it into the moral structure of society. Starvation became not just a danger, but a reminder, a symbol of what happens when humility, stewardship, and community fail. The erosion of Rome. Though the Roman Empire had already fractured, the events of 536–550 were perhaps the final blow to the classical world. In cities that had survived invasions and political chaos, the famine undermined the last remnants of urban food networks. Aqueducts fell into disuse as maintenance ceased. Public granaries crumbled or were repurposed into housing. Centralized bakeries were replaced by household and communal ovens. Administrative control of food supply vanished. In the East, Constantinople maintained some of these systems, but even there they were weakened. In the West, cities emptied further. The idea of the self-sufficient rural settlement, part villa, part farm, part chapel, became the foundation of daily life. This was not an intentional policy. It was the result of starvation, of roads left unused, and of people turning inward to survive. Quiet heroes. Though names are rare, it is worth remembering the quiet heroes of this catastrophe. The millers who worked through the night to grind precious grain. The monks who rationed bread and prayed over boiling stewpots. The mothers who walked for miles to trade a cloak for a handful of barley. The children who learned to recognize edible weeds and roots. The scribes who recorded the skies, the deaths, and the blessings amid the hunger. Their deeds were not recorded in gold-leaf manuscripts or heroic verse, but without them, fewer would have lived to write the next chapter. Final reflection. As we conclude the story of the famine of 536, we are left with a moment of silence, one befitting a disaster so vast, so slow, so thoroughly forgotten in popular history. There were no great battles won in those years, no monuments raised, no empires expanded, and yet The people who endured through adaptation, community, and sometimes sheer will gave shape to the world that came after. Because survival itself, quiet, repetitive, painful survival, can be history's most powerful legacy. So we end with this final thought. When the world darkens, and there is no enemy to fight but the sky itself, how does humanity find the courage not to win, but simply to endure? Story 5. Survival in the Longhouse, Norse Strategies Against Starvation. In the frozen silence of a Norse winter, long before the sagas were written and the gods carved into stone, survival was not about raiding or glory, it was about enduring the cold together, in longhouses that were equal parts home, barn, pantry, and shrine. Before the Vikings became seafarers, they were farmers, herders, and survivors of some of the harshest climates in Europe. This story is not about longboats, but about longhouses. Not about Odin's wrath, but about the rationing of smoked meat. It is about how Norse communities planned, stored, preserved, and endured, living in delicate rhythm with a brutal environment where misjudging the size of your winter stores could mean death. In this first section, we step inside the longhouse, the architectural and emotional core of Norse survival, and explore how it was built not just to shelter people, but to contain a year's worth of planning, discipline, and hard labor against starvation. The longhouse's life. From Iceland to Norway to the Faroe Islands and beyond, the longhouse was the essential structure of Norse domestic life between the 6th and 11th centuries. These were not castles or temples. They were simple, elongated wooden structures, often turf-covered for insulation, with a single central hearth and no windows. But inside them was everything: the family, the livestock, the tools, the food, and often the stories. Longhouses were typically between 15 to 75 feet in length and divided into zones. A central living space, with a fire pit or hearth and benches along the walls. Animal stalls at one end, often occupied during the winter. Pantry space for dried meat, barrels of preserved fish, sacks of grain or dried herbs. Sleeping areas often communal, with bedding made of straw, skins, and wool. It was dark, smoky, and crowded. Privacy was non-existent, but the warmth of the fire, the body heat of animals, and the insulation of thick sod walls kept death at bay. The longhouse was not just a building, it was a year-long strategy for survival. Food planning as a seasonal discipline. In Norse regions, particularly in Scandinavia and Iceland, the growing season was short, often limited to May through September. That meant that all the food for winter, sometimes 7 or 8 months, had to be planned, grown, gathered, preserved, and stored in a tight seasonal window. This required calendar precision, knowing when to plant barley or oats before the frost returned. Efficient harvesting, using scythes and sickles, hay was dried for animals, while cereals were reaped and winnowed by hand. Preservation protocols. No modern canning existed. Every household had to master salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, or storing in bogs or cool pits. Storage calculations. Each family had to estimate the food needed for people and livestock alike. Hay was often the limiting factor. If there wasn't enough for animals, they were slaughtered early, and the family had to preserve the meat quickly. A poor harvest meant real risk. There was no market safety net, no shipments. The food you put away by mid-autumn was all you had. Every decision made in summer was a wager on the severity of the winter to come. Preserved foods, the cold cellar of the North. Preservation was not a luxury, it was an expectation. Meat. Livestock were slaughtered in late autumn, known as slaughter in Old Norse, to conserve feed. Meat was hung in smokehouses built beside the longhouse. Salting was common for pork and beef, though salt had to be acquired through trade in some regions. Wind drying, especially for lamb and fish, was widely practiced in coastal areas. Sausages and blood puddings were made from offal to prevent waste. Fish. Cod, herring, and trout were dried or fermented into stockfish and rackfish. These could last through multiple winters when stored in cool, dry places. Fish were so vital that they became a form of currency in some regions. Grains and legumes. Barley and oats were stored in dry granaries or clay-lined pits. Peas and beans were dried and rehydrated in stews throughout winter. A porridge of barley known as grout was a daily staple. Dairy. Milk was quickly processed into butter, cheese, or sour milk to avoid spoilage. Skyr, a cultured dairy similar to yogurt, originated in this era and could last for weeks. Roots and foraged goods. Turnips, onions, and cabbages were buried in cool pits. Berries were dried or fermented. Herbs were hung from the rafters to dry slowly in the smoky air. Each of these foods had designated storage areas inside or near the longhouse, designed to keep moisture, rodents, and rot at bay. Community and survival. Though Norse society valued independence, survival was communal. Families helped one another with harvests, shared preservation equipment like smokehouses or mills, and traded surpluses when possible. Winter was a time of limited movement. Roads were often impassable, visitors rare. The longhouse became an island in the snow, and those within relied entirely on what had been stored. Social gatherings called blot were religious and seasonal, tied to the harvest, midwinter, and the return of light. These were moments of ritual feasting, often carefully rationed so as not to deplete stores too early. In these gatherings, memory became a form of sustenance. Stories of ancestors, of past winters, of spirits and gods, these kept spirits alive when food ran low and darkness was absolute. Signs of starvation. Despite all preparations, some winters were harder than others. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements shows signs of seasonal malnutrition. Growth interruptions in children's bones. Anemia from protein scarcity. Patterns of winter burial suggesting higher mortality between January and March. These deaths were not always recorded. There were no chronicles in most of these settlements, but the rhythm is clear. When hay was low, animals died. When animals died, humans followed unless preservation had been wise and the community generous. Still, the fact that Norse populations expanded into Greenland, Iceland, and parts of Russia during this period tells us something powerful. They didn't merely survive, they adapted. Closing thought. Inside the Norse longhouse, every beam and barrel had purpose. Every dried fish, every smoked leg of lamb, every sack of oats was a hedge against oblivion. It was not a world of abundance. It was a world of anticipation, of careful planning, of community over comfort. And so we are left to wonder. When winter becomes a way of life, is survival measured in food or in the discipline it takes to make it last? Inside the Norse longhouse, winter was not a season, it was a mindset. Even in late summer, the coming cold shaped behavior, language, and daily choices. While the harvest might yield barrels of fish, piles of barley, and sides of smoked meat, Norse families knew this meant nothing if the stores weren't managed with precision. In this section, we explore how the Norse practiced rationing and restraint, using systems of social memory, religious ritual, and communal planning to survive the long, dark months. We'll look at how the psychology of scarcity shaped Norse life just as much as the food itself, and how starvation was avoided not through abundance, but through self-control and shared discipline. The art of the ration. The Norse had no written ledgers for food distribution in most households. Instead, rationing knowledge was oral, passed from elders who remembered hard winters. The rule was simple: never trust the first full pantry. Even in good years, food was measured with frugality. Barley porridge might be served twice daily, but with smaller portions as winter dragged on. Meat was reserved for feasts, special days, or the sick. Dried slices were often shaved into stews to stretch a portion. Bread was made thinner or mixed with ground bark, whey, or peas during lean times. Animal fats, so important for calories, were stored in wooden tubs and rationed by the spoonful. The longhouse mother or matron often controlled food distribution, especially during the harshest months. Her role was central: part cook, part accountant, part caretaker, part survival strategist. Children were taught early: waste nothing and eat slowly. This wasn't just good manners, it was survival training. Animals indoors, warmth and food security. In winter, Norse longhouses often housed animals indoors, especially sheep, goats, and sometimes even cows. This served multiple purposes. Body heat from animals helped warm the home. Animals were easier to feed in enclosed spaces during snowstorms. Proximity allowed daily collection of milk, manure, and eventual slaughter when feed supplies ran low. This arrangement wasn't comfortable. The smell, the dampness, and the noise made for a crowded living space, but the sacrifices of comfort were made willingly. Every day the animals lived was a day of deferred slaughter and a day closer to spring. If animals died midwinter, they were butchered immediately, and the meat either boiled into stew or preserved through freezing or smoking. Nothing was wasted, not skin, not marrow, not bones. The midwinter point, turning toward light. Midwinter Jol was both a terrifying and hopeful time. Around late December or early January, days were at their shortest, and food anxiety was at its peak. By this point, fresh food was entirely gone. Preserved goods were halfway consumed. Hay was running low. Morale dipped with the darkness. And yet, Jol was also a time of ritual feasting. Animals slaughtered in the autumn were now ready for eating, properly cured and safe to consume. Communities marked the occasion with ale brewed from remaining grain or honey, pork, lamb, or sausages served in shared meals, toasts and blots, sacrifices, to the gods, especially Odin and Freya, for the return of the sun and future fertility. Storytelling, singing, and games by firelight to distract from fear. These celebrations were acts of emotional preservation, reminding people they had survived thus far and giving them strength to endure what remained. Yet even the feasting had rules. The best cuts were often saved for honored guests, elders, or gods, nothing excessive. The joy was real but measured. Social memory, fear as tradition. Unlike societies where abundance was the norm, Norse culture built its identity on respect for scarcity. Winter starvation was not a shameful topic. It was spoken of openly. Grandparents told children about the lean years, about the time when the fish did not return, or when snow came early and stayed too long. This wasn't to frighten, it was to educate. In Norse culture, being prepared was a moral good, and being careless with food could bring communal shame. Proverbs and sayings reinforced this. Better a half loaf than no bread. He who wastes in autumn weeps in spring. A full belly forgets the cold until the barrel is empty. These were not warnings, they were tools for survival. Food consciousness was woven into the very language and worldview of the Norse. Hunger and hierarchy. In times of extreme scarcity, social rules flexed but rarely broke. Elders might refuse food to allow the young to survive. Guests were still honored with the best food available, even if it meant tighter rations for the family. In chieftain households, feasting obligations were maintained longer, but when stores ran low, even warriors accepted reduced meals. In sagas, great leaders are praised not for lavish banquets, but for having enough food to feed all, even in famine. A stingy leader could lose followers. A generous one, even in hardship, could gain political loyalty. This connection between food, leadership, and trust was foundational to Norse society. Foraging and emergency foods. When stores ran low, The wild offered last resort options. Frozen fish from under the ice. Lichen and moss, boiled with broth. Bark bread, made by mixing inner birch bark with flour. Seaweed rich in nutrients, eaten raw or dried. Small game, trapped in snow-covered forests. These were foods of desperation, but also resilience. Norse people understood their landscape intimately. Their ability to survive wasn't just in stored food, but in the ability to pivot when stores failed. Emotional survival, stories, spirits, and firelight. As the cold deepened and food thinned, psychological endurance became as vital as calories. Storytelling was constant epic poems, family tales, ghost stories. Myth reminded them of gods who endured their own trials, Odin sacrificing himself, Thor wandering in hunger. Children were taught that winter was the testing ground for strength, both spiritual and physical. Fires were carefully tended, light became sacred, and the longhouse itself was treated with reverence. The house, after all, was the final barrier between life and death. And within it, every ember, every crumb, every story helped to carry the community one day closer to spring. Unfinished thought. And so winter passed slowly, painfully, with careful hands measuring portions and hopeful voices greeting each thin sunrise. The longhouse, battered but standing, became more than shelter. It became a memory palace of restraint, ritual, and endurance. And we are left with a question. In a world where hunger visits every year, what do people choose to preserve not just in barrels, but in belief? When the ice cracked and rivers began to run again, when the snow melted from the sod roof of the longhouse and light crept back into the cracks of the wooden walls, the Norse people emerged. They did so carefully, deliberately, not in triumph, but with the cautious optimism of those who had survived a reckoning. Spring was not a celebration. It was a resumption, a continuation of work, a brief window to rebuild what had been lost. In this final section, we explore what came after the hunger. The thaw did not simply end hardship, it began the next cycle. And the memories of scarcity, discipline, and shared struggle left behind not just stories but systems, rituals, and a way of life that carried Norse communities through centuries. The fragile spring. Spring was a time of paradox. It meant hope but also exposure. Stores were lowest just as workloads increased. Calves and lambs were born, but couldn't yet provide food. Fields had to be tilled and sown, but energy was scarce after months of rationing. Travel resumed, and with it, the spread of disease and the reordering of alliances. There was joy, of course, fresh water from melted streams, the first green shoots, eggs from long-dormant hens, but these were small victories, not guarantees. The true safety of the community would not return until the first summer harvests, usually weeks or months later. In some regions, especially in Iceland, spring was marked by a ritual inventory of remaining food. Heads of household would count each barrel, each sack, and make final rationing decisions. In lean years, it was not uncommon to dilute meals further in the final weeks to bridge the gap to new food. Communal labor and shared recovery. Once the ground thawed, work began immediately. Fields were cleared of stones and winter debris. Animal pens were emptied, cleaned, and restocked. Sowing began with barley, oats, and hardy legumes. Fishing resumed, often becoming the first reliable food source of the year. This labor was communal. Families helped neighbors. Tools were shared. Plowing was done in teams because one person's poor harvest could affect the village in the winter to come. Cooperation, not competition, defined Norse rural life. Women's work was particularly critical. Spinning, weaving, preparing new dairy products, overseeing planting and children's education in food preservation. In sagas, women who were skilled in land management and storage were praised as highly as warriors. The months of spring were filled with repairs, broken tools, damaged fences, cracked storage bins, and longhouses themselves. Everything was patched, bound, tied, or replaced, with an eye toward surviving the next winter, which was never far off in the Norse mind. The return of trade. With warmer weather came movement. Trade routes reopened, especially in fjord communities, bartered goods included. Salt for preservation, iron tools, dried fish, butter and cheese, wool and woven cloth. But food remained the most valuable currency. Surpluses were sold or traded with nearby settlements, often at high prices. A well-managed household might trade a barrel of skyr or stockfish for tools, animals, or favors. This barter economy was local and practical, but it also reinforced social status. Households that had enough to share or enough to sell were elevated in community esteem. Norse chieftains often used food stores as diplomacy. A feast held in spring, after a hard winter, was not just celebration, it was a political gesture, demonstrating the leader's ability to provide. Oral history and memory keeping. The Norse had no writing system in common use for record keeping until the late Viking Age, so oral memory was the archive. Stories of hard winters, of starvation averted or endured, were passed down in sagas and hearthside tales. These were moral instruction as much as entertainment. Your great-grandmother once made broth from boiled hoof and lived. The winter of the goat's breath, so cold the fish froze in the nets. We lost the cow, but your uncle found the hidden roots near the riverbank. These tales taught children how to adapt, how to respond when food failed or snow came early. They also reinforced cultural values. Courage in lean times. Generosity when stores allowed. Discipline in preserving and planning. Respect for the power of the natural world. By telling and retelling these experiences, Norse families ensured that even famine became a teacher. The philosophical code. The Norse worldview did not see nature as a force to be conquered, but as something to endure, to respect, and to live alongside. Their gods were powerful, yes, but they too suffered. They hungered. They fought against cold and chaos. In this spiritual lens, survival wasn't weakness, it was a kind of honor. Odin sacrificed comfort and sight for wisdom. Thor traveled hungry and exhausted to protect others. The world itself was prophesied to end in winter, Ragnarök, not fire but frost. This mythology reflected the realities of life in the north. Cold was not just weather, it was a cosmic challenge, and surviving it was a sign of strength, cooperation, and reverence. A cultural blueprint. What did the Longhouse teach? That survival requires planning. That food is more than sustenance, it is social glue. That rituals, feasts, and stories bind communities through hardship. That fear, when remembered properly, becomes discipline. These lessons outlived the Viking Age. They were passed on to later generations of Scandinavians, embedded in seasonal festivals, rural customs, and even modern Nordic culture's deep emphasis on sufficiency and simplicity. The quiet heroism of endurance. In closing, we return to the Longhouse, not a hall of kings, but a house of farmers, of mothers who measured porridge, of fathers who butchered in the cold, of children who learned when to eat and when to wait. They did not conquer lands, they did not invent monuments, but they survived with fire, with food, with fellowship. Final reflection. When we think of Norse history, we imagine sails and swords. But perhaps the greater act was not crossing the sea, but crossing the long, dark winter, one small meal at a time. So we end with a question whispered in firelight, passed down from elder to child. Is the true strength of a people measured by how they fight, or by how they endure the silence between seasons? Story 6, Barley and Beans, the forgotten diet of the Frankish poor. In the grand narratives of early medieval Europe, the Merovingians and Carolingians loom, large kings crowned, bishops ordained, borders redrawn. But beneath these high events, there was another world, quieter and closer to the earth. It was the world of fields and kitchens, of barley and beans, and the people who lived by them. In this story, we descend from royal courts to the muddy lanes of Frankish villages, tracing the rhythms of the poor, the farmers, herders, and field hands who never made it into the annals of war or religion. Their lives were shaped not by diplomacy or conquest, but by the steady cycle of planting, harvesting, storing, and eating. This first section explores the daily diet of the rural poor in the Frankish realms between the 6th and 9th centuries. What did they eat? How did they get it? And what does their simple, repetitive diet tell us about survival, community, and the underdocumented mechanics of life in the so-called Dark Ages? Down in the village, the Frankish world, roughly encompassing modern-day France, Western Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Switzerland, was an agrarian society. Over 90% of the population lived in rural settlements, clusters of wooden huts, barns, granaries, and fields. These villagers lived under lords, worked the land, and paid their dues in labor and produce. Their lives were hard, their options limited, and their meals were shaped not by choice, but by climate, soil, and necessity. Most peasants did not own the land they farmed. Instead, they lived as colony, tenant farmers, or serfs, with obligations to give a portion of their harvest, sometimes as much as half, to their lord or the church. What remained was theirs to live on, and what remained was often barley and beans. The backbone of the diet. Let us consider the typical Frankish peasant's table, not during a feast, but on an average day in early spring, just before the first planting. Bread, coarse and dark, made from barley or rye, rarely wheat. Pottage, a thick stew of beans, peas, or lentils, sometimes with onions or wild herbs. Grain porridge, cooked over embers, eaten hot or cold. Turnips, cabbage, or leeks, boiled or fermented in brine. If lucky, a small piece of salted pork, or more likely, lard used for flavor. On occasion, goat's milk, thin and sour, or small beer, a weak fermented brew safer than water. This was not a menu, it was a cycle. The same ingredients appeared in various forms: boiled, baked, or mashed. Flavors were mild, sometimes sour, sometimes smoky. Meals were shared communally, eaten from a central pot or trenchers of stale bread. Variety was limited, but nutrition was adequate when the harvest had been good. Barley, the underrated grain. In modern times, barley is often relegated to beer and livestock feed. But in the early medieval Frankish world, barley was survival. Easier to grow than wheat. More resistant to poor soil and cold weather. Matures faster, ideal in region with short growing seasons. Barley was ground into flour, cooked into porridge, and used in sourdough or flatbreads. It was also fermented into ale, a daily drink that provided calories, hydration, and mild euphoria. Barley flour lacked the gluten of wheat, making for denser bread, but it was hearty and filling. Most villagers ate barley bread daily, often dipped in pottage or eaten with a smear of curdled milk or bean mash. To bake required a communal oven. Many villages maintained one near the church or manor. Families took turns using it, sometimes paying with extra loaves or labor. Beans, the peasant's protein. The Frankish poor rarely saw meat. Hunted game was restricted by law. Livestock was expensive and reserved for milk, wool, or plowing. But beans, fava, broad, and field peas provided crucial protein, fiber, and minerals. Beans were easy to dry and store for winter use. Cooked slowly in clay pots over embers. Flavored with herbs, onion, or animal fat if available. Eaten alone, mashed, or mixed with grain. They were so vital that monasteries often grew rows of legumes just to distribute to the poor. During Lent, beans were one of the few permitted foods, leading to widespread cultural familiarity with their preparation and preservation. Over time, recipes developed. Bean pastes, mixed vegetable stews, fermented bean cakes. These were not delicacies, but they were nourishing. Wild food and seasonal foraging. The forest and field filled the gaps when stores ran low. Nettles rich in iron, boiled into broth. Acorns soaked and mashed into coarse flour. Mushrooms cautiously collected and cooked. Snails and frogs, sometimes eaten near rivers and marshes. Wild apples, berries, and sloes, dried or fermented into preserves. Foraging was both survival strategy and tradition. Children were taught which leaves could be chewed, which roots could be boiled. In spring, these wild foods helped bridge the hungry gap, that period before the new crops were ready. Some were dried and saved. Others, like fresh greens, were eaten immediately, often with flatbread or beans. A diet of repetition. The Frankish poor did not have cookbooks, they had repetition. Meals rarely changed. Food was fuel, not art. A poor family might eat the same dish, say, bean pottage with turnip every day for weeks. If meat was included, it might be a bone to flavor the pot, used for several meals. But this monotony had advantages. Predictability allowed for better rationing. Simpler diets reduced preparation time. Foods were familiar, easy to digest, and culturally reinforced. And there was comfort in the known. Even the poorest peasant knew the sound of bubbling stew, the smell of baking grain, the feel of warm bread in cold fingers. Hunger in the margins. When harvests failed, as they often did, the cracks in this diet became chasms. Barley stores dwindled, beans ran out, root vegetables rotted or froze. In such times, diets devolved. Bark bread, made with pine or birch bark ground into flour. Moldy grain picked through and boiled. Animal hides boiled to extract fat. Clay, chalk, or dirt consumed by the desperately hungry. Famine was not rare. Chronicles record years of great mortality, when fields gave nothing and whole families starved quietly, unrecorded. Often, hunger came not in one catastrophic moment, but in slow, seasonal attrition, each year a little leaner, until the breaking point. The dignity and the simple meal. Yet in normal times, the daily bread and beans sustained not only bodies but a rhythm of community. Food was shared, meals eaten together. The pottage pot was refilled by whoever had more. Celebrations were rare but sacred. A bit of salted pork, a handful of honeyed nuts, a cup of stronger ale. These small luxuries were enough to mark time, to offer relief, to remind even the poorest villager that life continued. Unfinished thought. And so we leave the poor of the Frankish countryside not nameless, but voiceless in the records, their memory carried in the shape of a clay pot or the grooves of a grindstone. Their legacy is not in stone inscriptions, but in barley fields and bean rows, planted again and again. And we are left with a question. If survival is measured not in kings but in calories, how many forgotten lives made history possible simply by eating the same meal twice a day and enduring? The daily meals of the Frankish poor were modest, repetitive, and grounded in necessity. But even within the boundaries of scarcity, time was marked through food. The year, for both laypeople and clergy, was structured by a rhythm of feasts and fasts, moments of shared celebration, piety, or restraint. In this section, we move beyond the basic diet to explore how the church calendar, agricultural patterns, and local custom created a fragile but functional structure of eating. We examine how even the poorest families in the Frankish world experienced seasonal variation, moments of communal joy, and religious observance, all tied to the humble ingredients they depended upon. These cycles gave meaning to life, even when the meals themselves remained plain. The liturgical year, faith and food. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Christianity was not only dominant in the Frankish realms, it was deeply woven into the daily life of even the most rural villages. For the poor, this meant that eating was also an act of faith. The church dictated when to feast: Easter, Pentecost, Saint Days, harvest festivals. When to fast Advent, Lent, Fridays, Ember Days. What could be eaten during fasts? No meat, sometimes no dairy or eggs. While clergy and nobility often skirted these rules or indulged during lean feasts, the peasantry generally followed them. Not only were they pious, but abstaining from rich food was often already their default state. During Lent, for example, the removal of meat and dairy had little effect. Many peasants couldn't afford these to begin with. However, it formalized an already austere lifestyle into a spiritual act. Eating barley gruel, foraged greens, or dried legumes became part of a sacred rhythm. The role of feast days. And yet, for all the scarcity, there were moments of genuine festivity. A village might celebrate the harvest, often in late August or early September, the dedication day of their local church or saint, marriage feasts, which the whole community would attend, the rare visit of a bishop or noble. On these occasions, the poor were sometimes gifted food from their lord's stores: salted pork, cheese, honey cakes, or fresh eggs. Monasteries and churches were also known to distribute alms or communal meals during major religious feasts. Food at such events held powerful significance. It was ritual, reward, and relief. A child raised in a barley and bean household might remember the taste of roasted goose or the sweetness of dried fruit for the rest of their life, not because it was frequent, but because it was extraordinary. Seasonal eating, a necessity, not a trend. There was no concept of seasonal cuisine as preference. Food followed the cycle of the land. Spring, the hardest time. Food stores were lowest, and the first greens or milk became precious. Sour bread, pickled roots, and dried legumes dominated. Summer, foraging, animal milk, and early vegetables. Most effort went into preparing for the harvest. Autumn, the time of plenty. Grains harvested, beans dried, root vegetables stored. This was the season of preservation and relative indulgence. Winter, preserved foods ruled: salted meat, sour cabbage, grain porridge. Rationing began anew. Every bite eaten in December had to last until May. This reliance on nature also meant year-to-year variations were vast. A cool, wet summer might destroy an entire barley crop. An early frost could kill turnips. A single hailstorm could upend the bean harvest. The food calendar was therefore not only spiritual or seasonal, it was tenuous. Preservation and storage, the village's true wealth. The greatest resource in a Frankish village was not gold or silver, but a well-managed storage system. Barley and rye were stored in sacks or clay-lined pits, often in barns raised on stilts to keep away moisture and rats. Beans were dried on racks, then packed in linen or straw-lined baskets. Root vegetables were buried in cool, dark cellars or pits, insulated with hay. Animal fats and meat were salted, smoked, or packed in brine when available. Foraged goods, nuts, mushrooms, berries were dried or fermented. Each household depended on accurate calculations: how many mouths to feed, how long the stores must last, what backup sources could be tapped if needed. In many cases, women oversaw these calculations, making them not only managers of the hearth, but stewards of the family's survival. Their memory and intuition guided decisions more than written records. A single miscalculation, a lost sack, a spoiled barrel could tip a family into hunger. The church's role in feeding the poor. The early medieval church did more than preach. It was often one of the only structured institutions providing food relief. Monasteries, especially Benedictine, were required to maintain kitchens and bakehouses, give alms of bread and soup to the poor at regular intervals, offer food to travelers and beggars, especially on feast days, distribute extra harvests from monastery lands. Even in rural areas, churches would distribute barley, dried legumes, or vegetable stew to villagers during lean times. This wasn't just charity. It was a form of spiritual economy. Feeding the hungry meant storing up merit in heaven. That said, distribution was uneven. Some villages benefited greatly from nearby monasteries. Others, especially those far from ecclesiastical centers, relied entirely on local cooperation. Eating together, the village pot. Many poor households shared resources. A communal stew pot might be kept simmering for days, with families contributing. A scoop of beans, a chopped turnip, a strip of fat, a sprig of herb. Meals were often communal and cooperative, not just within households but across the village. In times of relative plenty, families would rotate meal hosting, each preparing a basic dish for others. This wasn't generosity, it was survival. A single family couldn't afford meat or legumes every day, but by sharing, everyone got some, at least occasionally. This system fostered community cohesion, but it also revealed the thin margin between stability and starvation. If one harvest failed, all suffered. Cultural values in the kitchen. The food culture of the Frankish poor was built around modesty. Extravagance was frowned upon. Even among those who could afford more, plain food was a virtue. Piety, fasting was not just religious, it was habitual. Hunger was spiritualized, and endurance praised. Efficiency, nothing was wasted. Pea pods were boiled for broth, crusts reused, fat rendered from every bone. Memory, oral traditions included recipes, food customs, and hunger tallies, ensuring knowledge of what to eat, when to eat, and what to avoid. These values reflected a world where food was both a material and moral necessity. Unfinished thought. Within this structured but fragile world of feast and fast, food was never just about taste. It was ritual, strategy, memory, and meaning. The poor did not control the land. They rarely tasted luxury, and yet they shaped the cultural and agricultural backbone of an empire, one pottage pot at a time. So we end with a question. When life is defined by limits, does the true richness come not from what is eaten but how it is shared, remembered, and sanctified? We've followed the Frankish poor through their daily meals, their calendar of fasts and feasts, their storage rituals, and their spiritual rhythms. But what happens when that system fails? In this final section, we explore what occurred when scarcity turned to starvation, when a fragile agricultural cycle, already built on minimal reserves, collapsed due to weather, war, or pestilence. We examine how communities responded, adapted, and sometimes vanished in the face of these pressures. And we reflect on how the peasant experience, rarely written, often forgotten, was nevertheless the foundation of early medieval Europe's endurance, and the quiet crucible in which modern Europe was forged. When the fields failed, the Frankish realms experienced numerous subsistence crises in the 6th through 9th centuries, many of which are sparsely recorded in annals or monastic chronicles. These include famine in 585, mentioned by Gregory of Tours, who describes people dying in ditches and eating grass. The Great Hunger of 792–793, likely due to extended rains, which led to the failure of both grain and forage crops. Numerous localized crop failures due to early frosts, droughts, or flooding. For a poor family, even a 10–15% drop in yield could mean disaster. Unlike the nobility, they had no granaries, no reserve wealth, and few animals to sell or trade. In such times, everything changed. Seed grain was eaten, ensuring the next year would also be poor. Foraging intensified, even for marginal or toxic plants. Livestock were slaughtered early, eliminating future milk or wool. Children were sent to monasteries, abandoned or taken in by relatives. Migration increased, entire villages sometimes emptied. These weren't dramatic collapses, they were silent attritions, and the burden fell hardest on the elderly, the sick, and young children. Coping mechanisms, food stretching and substitutes. To endure, people used desperate methods. Bark bread, a mixture of inner tree bark, straw, and old flour, was common. Indigestible, it caused bloating and sickness. Clay or chalk was eaten to suppress hunger, especially by children. Leather and old shoes were boiled into broth. Cats, dogs, and rats became part of the diet in some towns and villages, usually taboo, but permitted in crisis. Monasteries and churches were overwhelmed, unable to feed the numbers who came. Lords raised rents, withdrew support, or demanded produce that no longer existed. And so the peasant family, already living on barley and beans, had to make meals of bitter roots, mildew-covered grain, and hope. Cultural memory of famine. Hunger left deep scars on collective memory. Oral tales from the medieval period often preserve famine folklore, such as a village where people ate the thatch from their roofs, a woman who boiled stones to fool her children into thinking food was coming, tales of divine punishment for sin, as famine was often interpreted as God's wrath. But memory also reinforced adaptation. Instructions on how to identify edible wild plants. Stories that praised those who shared food, even in lean times. Rituals to bless fields and pray for rain, often blending Christian and pagan elements. Famine became both a spiritual cautionary tale and a practical handbook passed down across generations. The invisible deaths. Unlike noble battles or martyrdoms, the deaths of the rural poor went mostly unrecorded. A priest might scribble a note about many perishing in a margin. A monk might lament that the poor had vanished from the fields. But names, numbers, and stories were lost. Their burials were often shallow, hurried. Sometimes whole families disappeared between one harvest and the next. Yet it was these lives and deaths that preserved the agricultural continuity of the Frankish world. The village endured, rebuilt, and sowed again the next year because enough of them survived, even if barely. Adapting faith and farming. Despite these pressures, the Frankish poor learned and adjusted. Villages began planting multiple crops. If barley failed, beans might survive. Monasteries became more active in distributing seed grain and food during lean years. Certain fasts were relaxed in times of famine. The church acknowledged physical limits. The growth of hospital farms, lands maintained specifically to feed the poor, began under Carolingian reforms. Simple farming innovation spread. Better plows, crop rotation, drainage ditches. None of this eliminated hunger, but over generations, these adaptations reduced its frequency and intensity. What emerged was not prosperity, but a slightly wider margin of survival. The peasant legacy. Why does this story matter? Because the poor of the Frankish world did not simply suffer, they shaped history through their resilience. Their farming supported kings, their children filled monasteries, their surplus fed armies. Their tools, seeds, and storage practices were inherited by future generations. Their cultural memory of hunger and hope was embedded in the medieval mindset, influencing art, law, and religion. Without them, there is no Charlemagne, no Carolingian Renaissance, no European continuity. They are the invisible pillars of medieval civilization. A final scene. Picture then a Frankish village in the spring of 794. The barley harvest has failed. The beans sprouted late. Rats got into the grain sacks. But a mother kneels by a fire, stirring pottage made from withered roots and stale lentils. Her children sit silently, too tired to speak. Outside, a church bell tolls. And she serves the meal meager, smoky but warm. She does not know that historians will ignore her, that her name will vanish, that her labor will be buried beneath centuries of politics. But she has history in her hands, at that fire and that meal. Final reflection. So we close with a question. If a civilization survives not through kings but through kitchens, what would our chronicles look like if we started them in the smoke of the poorest hearth?